Hi folks, it's James here and welcome to this year's Christmas video. This video is going to be called Influences and Inspirations, and basically it's going to be me showing a lot of records and quickly talking about a theme which has always interested me. This idea of musicians and artists who pass the torch to each other, or who inspire each other, influence each other in some way. Thought this would be an appropriate thing to look at at this time of year. Obviously it's the season of goodwill and the season of giving, and after all it's one of the most wonderful gifts I suppose that an artist or a musician can ever bestow on somebody else, is the gift of inspiration or influence. But from the early days of my serious collecting, I've been very into exploring the influence that artists have on each other. And one of the first stories that really captured my imagination when I was learning about Led Zeppelin was when Jimmy Page invited Robert Plant down to his houseboat when he was thinking about inviting Robert to join the band. And the two men sat there and they kind of compared notes really, and they played some music to each other, and they established that they had a lot of common ground. And what I love about the story is that, Zeppelin went down in history as being one of the archetypal huge heavy rock leviathans, but the music which Plant and Page kind of established early on that they enjoyed was nothing like that kind of music. So for example, they were both big fans of the folk singer Joan Baez, who'd been a big presence on the American folk scene in the 60s. They both enjoyed the music of the psych folk band, the Incredible String Band. I think Robert was kind of more into them than Jimmy was, but they both admired them. And they were both really into the kind of acid rock scene, so they were both really into Love and also Moby Grape. And I just love that story, just this idea that they kind of came together, at least partly because they shared the same enthusiasms for music. And maybe it's the difference between being inspired and being influenced, is that you can be inspired but the music that you go on to make is not necessarily particularly like the music that inspired you. And it's quite good because lots of bands later on copied Zeppelin, but you often got the feeling that a lot of those bands were only really into Led Zeppelin, or bands that sounded like Led Zeppelin, whereas Zeppelin themselves had a huge wide variety of tastes. And so when I learnt that story, and I started to then get further into exploring music. I was into the Beatles heavily, by the time I was in my early 20s, and I kind of started to dig back into the history, and that's what got me learning about people like Buddy Holly, who obviously was an enormous seminal influence and an inspiration on the Beatles as well. Carl Perkins, who George Harrison loved so much that he actually changed his name to Carl Harrison when they went to Hamburg. And Little Richard, who they all absolutely loved. I mean, John Lennon absolutely worshipped Little Richard. It became quite essential quite early on to sort of realise where all this music came from, and I started to become alive to this idea of inspirations and influences, and that's always characterised my musical explorations to a large extent. It's kind of learning about what the people who I liked, and it's quite interesting, and it starts to make everything seem much more significant and much more varifocal, I suppose, when you start to realise how there's this immense network of influence which goes on. And some stuff is quite well known. I mean, you've got the Beatles, and you've got Presley and all those people, and that's quite a kind of obvious lineage. But then occasionally things become a bit more interesting. So, for example, in Black Sabbath, the band that really influenced Ozzy Osbourne more than any other was the Beatles, and the Beatles are not possibly always looked on with a great deal of affection by people who are into hard rock and heavy metal, and yet here's Ozzy in one of the absolute principal metal bands ever, and he absolutely worshipped the Beatles. But Tony Iommi, he had a kind of perhaps a more left of field influence, and that was Django Reinhardt, the famous gypsy guitarist who had lost some fingers of maybe his right hand in some kind of accident. And of course, when Tony Iommi lost some fingers in an industrial accident in the West Midlands when he was in his youth in a factory, and he kind of almost despaired, and then somebody played him a record by this guy and said, look, this guy became an amazing guitarist even though he was short of a few digits. And that's what inspired Tony to go on to he welded squeezy bottle plastic ends to his fingers and then carried on playing the guitar. There's an example of where Black Sabbath's music was not influenced by Reinhardt, but he was certainly a fairly major inspiration to Tony. Okay, so what else have I got for you here? Let's just whiz through a few things. So it's just going back to the Beatles. Paul McCartney in the 60s, derived a massive amount of inspiration from the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds. When he heard Pet Sounds, he thought it was the greatest album he'd ever heard. When he heard God Only Knows, it just completely blew his mind. And that's what inspired him to do Sgt. Pepper, and that kind of elevated the whole cultural pop scene that was going on in the 60s. So that's quite a famous example. What else do we have here? Okay, so George Harrison, meanwhile, in the 60s, found enormous inspiration in the music of Ravi Shankar. I think it massively reorganised George's brain in a way. He learned to play the sitar. He started writing much more imaginative music, and he was kind of responsible for bringing world music into pop and rock. Long before that became a fairly common thing. So yeah, I mean, Ravi Shankar was a massive influence, not only on George Harrison, but then it bled into the music of the Beatles as well. But George was a fan of lots and lots of different kinds of music. He absolutely loved the jazz pianist Hoagy Carmichael. He covered a couple of his songs on the album Somewhere in England, but he always spoke really admiringly of Hoagy Carmichael's singing and just his artistry as an interpreter. Okay, let's look at the Stones now, the Rolling Stones. So I mean, we're back on very secure territory now. We kind of know who influenced them. Obviously you've got Muddy Waters, and there's a famous story of when Mick Jagger met Keith Richards on the train station at I think it was Dartford in the 60s, and they hadn't seen each other since they were both kids. Mick had under his arm some records, one of which was by Muddy Waters and one of which was by Chuck Berry, and obviously that led to a very long friendship and successful business partnership. And what else do we have? But maybe it's a bit less well known that Mick Jagger absolutely worshipped at the altar of James Brown in the 60s. I think the Stones were involved with some kind of package deal in the 60s where they were touring America with some kind of, it was like a soul package with some rock and roll stuff. And Mick would go and watch. He'd kind of sit in the wings and watch James Brown just avidly to try and learn something from him, I suppose, about stage moves and about how to hold an audience captive. So that kind of, influenced Jagger's performance skills from that day in a fairly major way. Okay, so yeah, in the 60s we had the folk rock jangle of the Byrds, which was of course massively influenced by, let's skip ahead, by Bob Dylan. They covered his songs. They probably learnt to write their own material by drawing on Dylan's example. And Dylan, of course, he was absolutely beloved of lots of other people. George Harrison loved him, John Lennon loved him, but he was also loved by Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix was a huge Dylan fan. He covered the song All Along the Watchtower, but apparently he was an absolutely avid Dylan, fanatic in the 60s. So there's another example of where, inspirations and influences. Hendrix's music wasn't superficially very like Dylan's, but it was quite interesting that he loved and admired his music so much. And just going back to the Byrds for 1 minute, they were massively influenced, or Roger McGuinn was hugely influenced by John Coltrane in the 60s. That's where he started learning to play modal guitar solos, and that also, interestingly, that came from Ravi Shankar as well. So Roger McGuinn and George Harrison both derived musical succour from Ravi. I mean, lots of rock musicians have been influenced by John Coltrane. A good example would be Tom Verlaine from Television as well. Going back to Dylan for a minute, Dylan had his musical heroes. I suppose the big one was Woody Guthrie, and Dylan famously went to visit Guthrie in hospital, when he was ill. And lots of Dylan's early songs are deeply rooted in the musical architecture of Guthrie's songs. But Dylan also loved people such as Jimmy Rogers, the folk singer. Dylan was also a massive fan of Robert Johnson from Blind Willie McTell. And Dylan also was a big fan of Smokey Robinson, the soul singer, as was George Harrison. Harrison and Dylan both really admired Smokey. And Dylan, in the 60s, he described Smokey Robinson as America's greatest living poet, which was rather a nice tribute. And again, Smokey, you don't necessarily hear his music coming through very clearly in Dylan's music, but there was obviously a debt of inspiration there. We have Pink Floyd. Let's move on to Pink Floyd. So they had a big, wide variety of influences. One that jumps into my mind actually was Cream. They were all big fans of Cream, particularly Roger Waters and Nick Mason. Nick Mason said when he first saw Cream perform live in London, that's when he realised what he wanted to do with his life. I think he'd been an amateur musician already, but when the curtains went back and he saw Ginger Baker behind his huge double bass drum kit, and he just said just the volume and the power of it all just completely overwhelmed him and just made him realise that that's what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, was to, you know, be a rock star, be a rock musician. Roger Waters was a big fan of John Lennon and also a great admirer of Neil Young. I read an interview with him years ago where Roger Waters said something like, if I was to draw up a list of the 50 songs I wish I'd written, very few of them would not be by John Lennon and Neil Young. And Paul McCartney also is a big fan of Neil Young as well, which is not often known about. I read that in an interview somewhere. These facts just stick in my mind. Years ago when I went to the Phoenix Festival, which is a British festival in England, and Neil Young was headlining, and I watched the set. And then later on I learnt that Paul McCartney was actually watching that set from the wings. And Paul was not due to play the festival, he wasn't playing the festival, but he'd gone there especially to hear Neil play. So we have The Shadows. Hank Marvin was a big influence on David Gilmour from Pink Floyd. Also, as well, actually, Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits. Knopfler and Gilmour have fairly distinct guitar styles. I mean, they're both rooted in the blues, obviously, but it's quite interesting that both of them were really into the shads. Okay, moving on to Pete Townshend from The Who. Now, Pete Townshend, I read an interview years ago where he said in the 60s the artist that he spent most of his time listening to when it was during that period when he was writing all those really huge, massive Who hits was, of all people, Jimmy Smith. And Pete was really into jazz and bebop, but he was also into early jazz as well and jazz funk. You don't necessarily hear much Jimmy Smith coming through in the Who's music, but it was there. Okay, Eric Clapton was really inspired and influenced through the years by a few people. The band spring to mind. One of the reasons that Clapton turned his back on the power trio heavy blues thing in the end in the 60s was because he heard the kind of rustic folk rock of the band and decided that he wanted to go down a more acoustic direction. Also that influenced George Harrison and the Beatles as well. But Clapton was also really into J.J. Cale, who became a friend later in life. And Clapton's music and Cale's music kind of went parallel for a long time, and they had a good collaboration going. And of course Clapton was also, as were lots of other people, really into Bob Marley, who must be one of the most influential singers and songwriters of his era, or any other era, you know. I mean, Clapton did, of course, he did I Shot the Sheriff, and I think Clapton was really into reggae, although it's maybe not really a thing that he wore too much on his sleeve, but certainly for that one record he kind of he was one of the great popularisers of reggae, really, you know, via that cover version. I mean, Bob Marley was loved by so many people. Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd, one of the most influential musicians of all time. Some people that spring to mind that absolutely loved him were David Bowie. And if you listen to a lot of Bowie's early material, you can really hear that quirky English thing coming through. But Syd was also influential on other people too. He influenced Pete Townshend, and he went on to influence Mark Bolan in the 1970s, and then all kinds of people in the 1980s as well. That kind of indie psychedelic stuff that came up in the 60s, you know, think early Primal Scream, even up to things like Blur as well, and XTC. And then one of my favourite ones, Steely Dan. Donald Fagen always said that he was so into Duke Ellington that he would, when Steely Dan used to do the score, you know, for their songs, when they used to do the horn sections, they used to closely model everything they did on what Duke Ellington would have done. Just the choice of notes and the choice of you know, instrumental combinations. Ellington's music ran deep in Steely Dan. Another artist who Donald Fagen and Steely Dan absolutely loved as well was Henry Mancini, the guy that did the music for the Pink Panther. You know, that kind of lounge jazz, kind of cool jazz stuff, which runs through the Dan's music. To finish with, let's end on a Christmassy note and end with Phil Spector. Surely one of the greatest, most influential music producers of all time. Lots of names spring to mind, people who loved Phil Spector. Brian Wilson springs to mind. There's a famous story of when Brian Wilson was driving along the freeway, you know, in America in the 60s, and a Phil Spector song came on the radio. I think it was a Ronettes hit, and he said he was so flipped by it that he had to pull over into the lay-by and sit there and just listen to it. He said he just couldn't drive, he couldn't think, he couldn't speak, he was just paralysed by the brilliance of the sound. And you know, lots of people went on to be massively influenced by Phil Spector. One slightly offbeat name springs to mind, and that's John Cale. Cale always said that Spector and Brian Wilson, strangely enough, were two of the producers who'd most influenced his music. So that's my Christmas video for 2018, Influences and Inspirations. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back in the new year for more fun and games, so I shall take my leave of you by simply saying Merry Christmas, compliments of the season, and a Happy New Year. Bye-bye.
Let me put it this way, Paul. I always say that the best thing a musician or a writer can have on his tombstone is he passed it on.